This project was made possible by a grant from the Maryland Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Maryland Humanities Council.
This event is presented by the Montgomery College's Cultural Arts Center and the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. It is arranged by Art and Remembrance with support from the Maryland Humanities Council and the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here to join us for this wonderful event. We're very pleased to be partnering with Montgomery College, and I want to thank Sarah and Siobhan and as well as their staff for all their efforts in putting this program together. Just by way of introduction, I am the president and with my sister, the co-founder of Art and Remembrance, an organization. It's an arts and educational organization that we founded in honor of the legacy of my mother, whose art and story inspires us every day. And it was our intent to tell her story as well as those of others who've experienced war and oppression and who've told their stories through art and through narrative and in a way that can change, we feel, can change people's hearts and minds about those horrific events. This is part of our efforts. We recently completed the film that you're going to see with the generous support of the Maryland Humanities Council, and I did want to thank and recognize them for their support, as well as the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County, which also contributed to this evening's event. We've been very excited with the reception that the film has received thus far, and as your program notes, it's received audience favorite awards at the 2 film festivals that it's been, where it's been screened so far. And we don't have any balloting for the screening this evening, but we do have evaluation forms from Maryland Humanities Council. They're very eager to hear your reaction to this evening's program. So I would urge you to please complete those forms. You should have picked one up on your way in. If not, there are many more outside in the entranceway. And as a kind of incentive to help you feel motivated to return the form to us, you can also fill out postcards that will enter your name into a drawing for a $25 gift certificate to Barnes & Noble. And we're also going to be giving a copy of our book, Memories of Survival, in a drawing. So please, once again, we'd really appreciate it if you would complete those forms. Following the film, I'm going to be joined by an illustrious panel of women who will reflect on the themes of art, memory, and healing that the film surfaces. So we're going to look forward to your questions as well during that discussion. And in the meantime, please enjoy the film. Thanks very much.
I always thought of my mother as different from other mothers. She sounded different from other mothers. She pronounced words differently, and she had a past that other mothers didn't have.
She loved to sew, she loved to embroider, she loved creating beautiful things. Our mother was very driven to tell the story. She wanted us to know it, she wanted us to remember.
It was a way of connecting me and my sister with the family that she had lost. Her mother, her father, her sisters, her brother, nearly everyone that she loved in the world. At some point, she really began to look to me to be the storyteller, I had just read The Diary of Anne Frank, which came out around then. And so I started writing it. But I knew even then that nobody could really tell my mother's story. It was her story to tell.
I wanted to show my kids how I grew up. And I was trying desperately, but I never drew anything in my life. I said, well, I'm gonna try. So I bought this piece of cheap fabric. I thought I was just gonna mess around with. And I took a ruler, and I still see my house the way it was. And I just drew the lines, and then I started filling it out with crewel work. And then I made this straw roof, sort of. Now, when I finished the house, I was really satisfied the way it looked. That's the way it looked.
And once she found that way, it just poured out of her.
This event, moderated by Bernice Steinhardt, will now host a panel discussion. The following is the background information on each member. Bernice Steinhardt is the president and, with her sister, co-founder of Art and Remembrance, a nonprofit arts and educational organization inspired by the art and story of their mother, Esther Nissenthal Krenitz. Recognizing the power of their mother's art to change hearts and minds, they created Art and Remembrance as a testament to their mother's legacy and a means to share her work and those of others like her who depicted their experiences as victims of war, oppression, and injustice. Since its founding in 2003, the organization has created a traveling exhibit of Esther Krenitz's art, which has been exhibited at major museums around the country. Ms. Steinhardt is also the co-author of the award-winning book, Memories of Survival, based on her mother's artwork. Until her retirement from federal service in 2011, Bernice was a senior executive at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the investigative and analytical arm of the U.S. Congress. Over the course of 2 decades, she directed GAO's work on environmental, energy, and public health programs, as well as government-wide management issues, testifying numerous times before the Congress. For several years, she was also responsible for leading GAO's strategic planning. Her work led to major improvements in the effectiveness of federal policies and programs, as well as savings for taxpayers, for which she received a number of awards. Myrna Goldenberg, Montgomery College professor emeriti, has published seminal articles on women and the Holocaust and co-edited with Elizabeth Baer, Experience and Expression, Women, the Nazis, and the Holocaust, and with Rochelle L. Millen, Testimony, Tensions, and Tikkun, Teaching the Holocaust in Colleges and Universities. Different Horrors, Same Hell, Gender and the Holocaust, co-edited with Amy Shapiro, is in press. She has also published numerous reviews and articles on curriculum transformation, American Jewish women's literature and history, and college and university teaching. She was an editor of Potomac Review, a journal of arts and humanities, and Women Today, and editor and frequent contributor to Bella Tra and the Community College Humanities Review. Her current research focuses on the Holocaust poetry of American women. Dr. Goldenberg has been recognized by the Association of Community College Trustees and the Community College Humanities Association for outstanding teaching and by various groups for her civil rights work and community activism. Retired since 2005, she was appointed the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar of Holocaust Studies at the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey, 2005-2006. About 25 years ago, she invited Holocaust survivors who live in Montgomery County to tell the MC community stories of their experiences during the Nazi era. Thus began a tradition that continues as the annual Holocaust commemoration. Many other programs at MC have Myrna's fingerprints: Women's Studies, Women in Engineering, Math, Science, and Technology, the Food Pantry, the Feed'em Cedar, the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. The subtext of all of them reflects the responsibility each of us has to actively work to eliminate obstacles to individual and community well-being, as well as to assure equal opportunities for education, housing, good health, fulfillment through the arts, and work. Most of all, we need to find ways to diminish poverty and hunger and to work towards a just peace for all. Faye Moskowitz is professor of English at the George Washington University, where she currently teaches creative writing and Jewish American literature. She earned her BA and MA at GWU. She was chair of GWU's English department for 8 years, and prior to that, director of creative writing at the George Washington University. She served as president of the Jenny McKean Moore for Writers from 1975 to 1999. She was for many years fiction editor of Lilith magazine. Her writing draws heavily on her life experiences growing up during the Depression and her Jewishness in a largely Christian society. Her publications include Her Face in the Mirror, Jewish Women on Mothers and Daughters, The Bridge is Love, Whoever Finds This, I Love You, and A Leak in the Heart. Her most recent book is Peace in the House. She is represented in dozens of anthologies, and her poems, essays, and short stories have been published in such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Moment, and the Jerusalem Post. Faye's book on essays, And the Bridge is Love, has recently been reissued by the feminist press. Rachel Cohen is a clinical psychologist with over 25 years of experience in working with children, families, and adults, many of whom have survived trauma. She worked as a volunteer with Advocates for Survivors of Torture and Trauma, providing psychotherapy for people seeking political asylum in the U.S. She is currently based in Geneva, Switzerland, and has completed a certificate with the Harvard School of Public Health on refugee trauma. Dr. Cohen has become interested in the healing potential of narrative textiles and has made a short video displaying the work of women across many diverse cultures. Dr. Cohen consults with international NGOs on the mental health needs of refugees and has been working with survivors of war and trauma, developing psychosocial programs to support resilience and healing. In coordination with HIAS, she designed a child treatment center for Congolese refugees in Kampala, Uganda. Last week, she returned from the world's newest country, South Sudan, where in conjunction with IsraAid, she developed and ran a training program for community workers on helping survivors of sexual and gender-based violence.
As I said earlier, I'm joined this evening by an incredible panel to talk about a number of the themes that are raised by the film. In the film, we set out to tell two stories. On the one hand, there's the story of Esther's survival, from her childhood through the war and her arrival in the United States, the story that she tells for a better part of the film. On the other story, though, that we wanted to tell was the story of Esther, of how she came to make this incredibly beautiful body of work and what it meant to her. And while her story, the story that she tells, raises a number of really important issues and themes of racism and intolerance and oppression, what we wanted to focus on in the panel this evening were the themes that surface in the story about Esther, the story of her art, her memory, and its healing. And we have, as I said earlier, an incredible panel to discuss these themes. I'm going to begin with a question for Myrna. Given your familiarity with Holocaust scholarship and survivors' accounts, do you see something unique about the kind of artistic expression that has come out of the Holocaust?
Well, I'm going to begin with the words memory, because the art of the Holocaust is memory. Memory brought forth. And one of my favorite definitions of memory, aside from yours, which is nice and lengthy, is from Carol Shields, who wrote The Stone Diaries. In that introduction, she says, "Memory is not linear or chronological, neither is it narrative. Memory is like a series of slides, any one of which may flash up at any time, in no particular order and without links between them. In the mind, some years vanish into a black hole of oblivion, while a few minutes might hang there forever, brilliant with detail and effect, end quote. For the survivors of the genocide, specifically of the Holocaust, there's likely to be years of life in that black hole, not of oblivion, but a black hole brilliant with detail and effect. Survivors of any genocide live with the text of their experiences imprinted on the insides of their eyelids. They close their eyes and relive experiences of their own terror and of the terrors they witnessed, not once, but over and over and over again. But to tell their stories to non-survivors, they need art, whether musical, visual, dance, or literary. Art can communicate experience, emotion, and truth, and you saw that from the film. Art about the Holocaust counteracts the attempt to render Jewish death anonymous. And watching or listening to that art makes us secondary witnesses, as Elie Wiesel has said. In the process, we acquire two types of memories, those of the survivors and those that are our responses to their art. So we have poetry from survivors and dance performances and concerts and paintings and elegantly written memoirs and novels and plays, as well as those that are less elegant. And we have memories, theirs and ours. For the most part, all survivor memoirs begin with life before the catastrophe, whether the catastrophe is in Bosnia, Rwanda, South Sudan, Afghanistan, or Europe between 1933 and 1945. And then the survivors, usually in a flat, repertorial style, show the process that they suffered, beginning with identification that really for them meant separation from the larger community, moving on to humiliation, dehumanization, deportation, and finally, immersion in an overwhelming loss. Loss is a major presence in Holocaust literature and art, and I think Esther's pictures show that too. There's loss of family, friends, privacy, health, and loss of family photographs, which could help memory if they have them. But survivor narratives also talk or show or tell of friendship and the will to hold on to both hope and dignity. We often read sentences like, quote, "I wasn't going to let them rob me of my self-respect, and so I washed every day." I will go fast.
No.
Oh, okay, all right. And as painter Alice Kahana has remarked about the death march when she watched the SS officer and trying to maintain order, very vainly so, she wrote in her memoir, "He was a comical figure, like a character from a forgotten operetta. He was a clown bouncing around in this unreal landscape. Neither his whip nor his abusing words could penetrate our armor. When our legs could no longer carry our malnourished bodies, or when the cold became merciless, our weird sense of humor, our grimaces, and our senseless rhymes marched us forward," end quote. On the march, when a bystander German woman screamed obscenities to them when they begged for water, a boy held a cat's dish filled with water and offered it to them. Kahana refused for herself and her friends. She responded, "We are not animals." The three of us walked away with our last drop of dignity. We can hear Kahana, we can see the column of ragged, starving, thirsting women, and we can feel her restored sense of pride. I had planned to talk to you about Holocaust poets and painters, for example, Samuel Bach, and I have his book of paintings here if you want to see them. They are confrontational and haunting and reflect, in his words, the painful memories that do not fade away. And about Irina Klepfish, one of my favorite poets, whose father was one of the first, if not the first, I think he was the first fighting martyr of the Warsaw Ghetto. She writes in Yiddish and English to narrate her mother's memories in many of her poems, but most unforgettably in a poem called Beschert, Yiddish for fate. But after hearing Art Spiegelman earlier this week, I was struck by the uniqueness of the contributions he has made and presumably will continue to make, and compared them, in my mind, immediately to the fabric narratives of Esther Krinitz. Both have taken what had been considered lesser, undervalued forms of art and raised them to levels of beauty and aesthetic intelligence. Sewing, embroidery, crocheting, and knitting still fall into the category of folk art rather than fine art. Esther, however, used her technical and creative skills to translate her memories into stunning narratives. All at once, we experience a story of several dimensions in each wall hanging, so complex that we feel invited to touch, to get close to her story, to sort of get behind her scene and ask more from her. I am relieved that the art is behind glass to protect them from my fingers. I so much want to stroke or flip her braids, her pigtails, or pick apples from her trees or strawberries from the old farmer's garden. You have no idea how grateful I am that I can't do that. Because I say it like this. Art Spiegelman took the techniques of the lowly comic book and created a complex, complicated, brilliant set of narratives, his father's, his mother's, which he rescued from oblivion because the father had destroyed most of them, and his own as the son who lived vicariously through his parents' horrors. His memory is what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory, which is the experience of those who grow up dominated by narratives that preceded their birth. You grew up with that. In fact, I know of no other work that so richly demonstrates and transmits both generations' struggles. And you can see this later if you want to. They're comics, okay? But comics, he calls them instead of comics, that struggles to release and yet retain those memories. As Spiegelman explained how he created his narratives, or in his words, prowled the murky caverns of my memory, I thought about how Esther composed her pictures, moving our eyes around and deep into the canvases. Spiegelman does the same, manipulating our attention from frame to balloon and backwards and forwards. We experience a mediated terror, anguish, fear, anger, compassion in both their work. The art of these two survivors of different generations indeed envelops us, transforming us into these secondary witnesses and recreating us into a community that feels enriched yet haunted. They have given us truths as they live them, and through them we have been both expanded and embraced. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Faye, turning to my question for you. Esther told her story in a very particular way through fabric and needle and thread. But in addition to her images, she stitched a story. As a teacher and memoirist yourself, could you reflect on the ways that memoirs can be healing, both for the writer or the reader, or in this case, the viewer?
Well, I cheated just a little because I knew the question in advance. And I've thought a lot about memory and what it is and what it does. And so I'm really cheating because I'm going to read something that I wrote about it. Now, can everybody hear? You all hear? Hecher, can you hear? We are talking now of remembering, that random weeding out of experience so that what remains stands in relief like the drama of vivid blossoms freed from the distraction of undergrowth. Looking back, we perceive that a pattern has emerged, as though the years were a bolt of color unfurling from the loom, weft and warped and intricately, inextricably intertwined, already established in spite of the artist whose life itself creates the art. And we call these designs memory. Memory can chalk in childhood with the pastels of nostalgia, or cut like a whiplash into the face of sentimentality, Memory is a miner's lamp raving our journey down into darkness. For each of us, the journey is as personal and convoluted as the whorls of an individual fingerprint. But as memory is not linear, it has no single beginning or end. Flash a moment on a remembered scrap of nursery wallpaper, and suddenly a world returns. The creaking rocker, the breast, sticky and sweet, the face of your mother, safely young, and the song she learned years before those years, wrapped in her mother's own arms. Try as we might to shuck them off, the memories of childhood remain, strapped to our backs like bundles we are charged to carry always. We bear these burdens so long they become part of us, so familiar we forget sometimes their contents, but our shoulders round to their shape, even when we think we have momentarily set them aside. Memory is idiosyncratic, at once impish and implacable. What are we to do, for instance, with the unbidden specters that invade our nights, as the imprint of a searing sun floats ghostly before our eyes long after we have entered a darkened room? And how do we crack the mind's code when the desired image refuses to surface to the screen? What can we do but take on our ghosts, sift our memories, forgo beginnings, a shifty word where personal time is concerned? We will want the patience of the artisans who lined the winding streets of old St. Paul de Vence with flowers made of stones, the courage to taste our fathers in a smudge of ash, and the medallions of memory sun-struck will come. Today, we live in the midst of an electronic age. As the pace of life picks up more and more quickly, memory seems sometimes as fractured as the ephemeral images with which we are constantly bombarded. From the grainy newsreels of our youth to the ubiquitous and disposable television footage that now chronicles our days and ways, the visual has come to dominate our senses. All the more precious, then, the words caught between covers, words that tell us how it was to be alive at a certain time in history. As the stage manager says in Thornton Wilder's Our Town, this is the way we were in our growing up and in our marrying and in our living and in our dying. For who will testify? Who will accurately describe our lives if we do not do it ourselves? The world, our personal one, and the world that roils outside us is in constant flux. Each moment that occurs, no matter how seemingly insignificant, each shifting grain of sand makes the second that has just passed history. Yet we have our roots in that evanescence and are constantly transformed by it. Once something has been set loose in the world, it permeates the very air we breathe. We cannot be unaffected by what has gone before. We recapitulate history, our own and the world's, each time we draw breath. And as we document our days, the preservation of what has gone before is earnest of our faith in what's to come.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. I've been making notes to myself. There are a number of points that both Myrna and Faye touched on, some of which had great similarity and a lot of resonance for me and what I see in my mother's art and story. Let me turn to Rachel now, though. I know that you were in a program on refugee trauma, and while you were doing that, you came upon Esther's art and the art of other women who were working in fabric in a number of different places around the world. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a bit about
that season of discoveries and what you've been doing since then.
Absolutely. In a way, for me, this is a public opportunity to thank Art and Remembrance for a journey that I've been on that began only about a year ago with regard to narrative textiles. And I'll tell you a story, because this is all about stories. How I stumbled into this. I got an email from Minna about a year ago announcing
This is Art and Remembrance's executive director.
Sorry. Who I wish could be here this
Right,
evening.
Unfortunately is sick with pneumonia tonight.
Yeah. But she sent, I was living in Geneva, where I am based now, and an email went out to many of us announcing the Esther Krinitz exhibit at Strathmore last year, about this time. And on that same day, I got another email, thank goodness for the internet, from a colleague, an Australian colleague, who works with Hmong women and who are refugees from Cambodia. And these emails converged in my inbox, and they were so similar. The colleague in Australia, who was a psychologist also, was telling me about textiles done by Hmong women who create story cloths about their experiences. Maybe, let me... Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, okay, that's better. Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I'll tell you that on the same day that I received this email from Minna announcing the Esther Krinitz exhibit, the beautiful exhibit at Strathmore last year, I also got an email from a colleague in Australia who was telling me about Hmong women that she works with who had created story cloths that recall the atrocities that they had endured. And I actually have some slides to show you of that in just a moment. I posted a notice because I was so struck by this convergence, and I was not familiar with the phenomena that I have since been exploring more fully of women across many diverse cultures who create textiles, in particular textiles, to tell their stories and to heal. And I have been deeply moved by so many examples of this. So anyway, I posted a notice on this listserv of people who are involved in the global treatment of refugees surviving trauma, and popped up within an hour or so several more responses. A colleague of mine in Zimbabwe, who's also a psychologist, wrote me immediately and said, "You must meet my friend Roberta," who was here last week, Roberta Bacik. She's Chilean. She lives in Northern Ireland. She has curated textiles that were made under the reign of Pinochet that are arpieras, very, very beautiful, innocent depictions, very much like the ones we have just been absorbing, that Esther Krinitz did. Memories of Chilean women's experiences and recording their experience of trauma. So anyway, I said, wow, I have to meet this Roberta Bacik. She sounds amazing. And my friend Sherry in Zimbabwe sent me to her website. And I looked on the website, and although Sherry didn't know this, and I didn't at the time, I was shocked to discover that, of all things, Roberta would be the very next week in Geneva doing an exhibition of arpieras. Some people say there's no such thing as coincidence. I mean, this project really suddenly claimed me. I didn't find it, but it certainly found me. And before you knew it, I who could barely work my cell phone, was making a small video to record these many diverse and quite exquisite examples of women's efforts to tell their stories and to heal themselves in ways that we as therapists are generally unable to do with survivors of trauma. What is this? What is this phenomena that occurs across many cultures? Let me just move over so I can show you.
We should read that.
Yeah,
let's get out of the way. No, we're okay? Okay, good.
It's not going to advance. It's just a video. So these are some Hmong images. And you can see some of the similarities between the images that you'll see here and the images that Esther Krinitz also recorded, a world away, in a different time and place. These are from Cambodia. Let's stop here. I want to stop it just for a moment before we move on. The images that you saw from Cambodia became so subversive that, in fact, the Laotian government banned these story cloths, and they were smuggled out in order to tell the story of trauma there. And then I have some examples to show you of just a couple of arpilleras, Chilean arpilleras. This is one. Hundreds of these cloths were made, this one and many others, made from the clothing of the disappeared. They were sewn on flour sacks by women who had very, very little. Let me stop here, because I'm going to show you another example. The coincidence didn't stop there with my new Chilean friend who lives in Northern Ireland, who I then got a chance to visit. Just less than a month later in Geneva, an exhibit was brought to the UN there.
You should mention that you were living in Geneva.
Yes, I'm sorry, I live in Geneva now. So all this was coming at me. And there was an exhibit brought to the UN in Geneva. There's actually another exhibit of such quilts in New York right now. If you get a chance to go, it's toward the end of April. That is of quilts from around the world done by women, similar similar quilts.
It's being exhibited at the UN, I believe.
At the UN in New York now. This was in Geneva. About the time that I was just discovering all of this, again, a year ago. And then an exhibit came, and this is one of the quilts from that exhibit, done by women in the Democratic Republic of Congo who had survived, as you will see, all kinds of atrocities, including a good deal of gender-based violence. So these are images from the DRC done about 2 years ago. These are all panels that are part of a larger quilt that the women put together, actually women in Michigan. Women in Michigan took these panels made in the DRC and put them, assembled them together in a larger quilt. This piece is from Colombia, and you'll see some more images, again, of women who were sewing their stories. And this was also shown at the same exhibit at the Palais, the UN in Geneva. So I wanted to just give you a sense of the context in which I began to see this work of Esther Krinitz, that is a phenomenon that is quite profound and seems to be nearly universal, or at least occurs across so many different cultures. And I've given you a flavor for these, but there are actually very many more. And I continue every month to discover additional ones. And let me come back and sit down. You're my friends here. Thank you. And so maybe this one doesn't work so well. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Just
okay.
Lean close.
Lean close, okay. So I have to ask myself, as a therapist, as a clinician, why does this happen? What can we learn from this naturally occurring phenomena about healing itself? One of the things that has struck me so deeply is some kind of connection between what we have a very ancient Jewish tradition around as an expression of grief. When someone dies, we rent the cloth. We tear our clothing, tear it, yes? And what this impulse that's expressed in Esther Krinitz's work is just the opposite. It's to mend, it's to sew, as an expression of working through the grief. And there's something for me very powerful about that. And I think that as someone interested in healing and what happens in the process of healing, I'm not only moved, extremely moved by the images themselves, but also by the process behind those images, behind the creation of those images. What exactly is happening? And, you know, clearly, Esther Krinitz and other women like her around the world feel an enormous urge to do this activity as they heal. And I've been thinking about what we can take from this and trying to design some specific kinds of programmatic healing groups based on this phenomena. For example, the women in Chile come together, some of them still do, but they did in the 70s, began to come together in workshops, in groups, and they would sew, and they would talk. And there were silences as well. There was something enormously safe about sewing. And about creating these stitches, the rhythmic quality, the meditative quality of the stitches. And you see in the images that we enjoyed together of this film, the enormity of the immense number of stitches, how many thousands of hours of intricate work. We know that, for one thing, this has a very calming effect on the central nervous system, that it forces you to focus, to concentrate, to slow down. A central nervous system that's been trained over years of trauma to be on high alert, finds another rhythm altogether. And there's a quality of breathing which we try to teach trauma survivors about breath and about meditation and so forth, and ways of self-regulating. And it seems that the stitching itself has a quality in it that allows for that to occur. Also, when people interact around the stitching, they don't have to look at each other. There's an intimacy that can develop between people without having to face one another in the eyes. And that has a power as well. There are many aspects of this. I think I've overrun my time, but but there's the calming, there's the connection with others and the mutual support that occurs, something that's profoundly destigmatizing for trauma survivors. There's also, of course, what you've all spoken about, the chance to be heard and to tell one's story, and to do so taking one's time, and to do so with in a nonverbal modality. We know that trauma lives in nonverbal images, and trauma lives in our musculature, in our bodies. And the fact that the tactile quality of being with the cloth, of being with the memories, and being with the stitching in one's body, the kinesiological experience of that, I think is also an element that's quite profound. I think I'll leave it at that and let the rest.
Great. Well, I'm very mindful of the fact that we got off to a late start, and I do want to open it up to audience questions. But before we do, if very quickly, Myrna and Faye, I think Rachel surfaced a number of extremely powerful ideas, concepts, and I'd appreciate it if you could, again, very briefly, just connect perhaps some of her ideas about healing and what she's observed in looking at work done across cultures to the concepts, the ideas of art and memory.
Okay, well, I'm happy to start. While I was listening to both, to Myrna, to both of you, I'm sorry. I couldn't help but think of American women on the frontier, women in the territories, women who were often isolated, and certainly women who were taken away from their families. Many of them knew when they left the North and the East and headed out west that they probably wouldn't see their parents again or their siblings. And so I'm thinking of quilting bees. Thinking of women getting together at the stage where the top of the quilt had already been pieced by an individual woman, that the pieces were made out of fabrics that had to do with their lives because nothing was wasted. So here a design is made out of a shirt of your husband's. Here a flower is created by a dress that a child of yours wore. But when the time of the quilting bee came, the women came together, they told their stories, and I think the loneliness that many of them, most of them suffered, was assuaged by this communal effort at sewing.
And very quickly, I'm reminded of the women after the Sarajevo rape camps who got together and did handiwork. They didn't have to see each other. It was too embarrassing to look at someone else. And yet that getting together to work through something helped them heal as much as they could heal. And maybe that's why knitting groups are so absolutely the rage now, because in the same way, you sit and you talk, and you look at your work and not at each other, and intimacy is created.
Great, thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes.
I wondered, have you found any instances where men do these activities?
Did everybody hear the question?
Please repeat all questions.
Okay. The question was whether any of us had come across instances in which men came together to share these kinds of activities and experiences.
I can say that in Hmong culture, men do some of these story cloths. It tends to be sometimes that men design them and women do the sewing. But sometimes it can be a collaborative effort. I haven't discovered other groups in which men do the narrative textiles, but they could exist.
Well, we know that men on the old sailing ships where the ship was gone for months and months and months, that these men crocheted, knitted, some of them embroidered, and some of them did actually did pictures of back home in ways to sort of counteract the homesickness. So yes, men do needlework.
And they did scrimshaw on whalebones, but I don't know of the kind of intensity at needlework and so on that corresponds to what we have from say from Esther or from the Hmong women and so on. But I'm sure it's something. Maybe they whittled on it.
Bonnie, yeah.
I don't know about the intensity or the location, but I'm thinking about the output from people when they were in Japanese relocation camps in World War II. Great exhibit at the Renwick about 2 years ago. Lots and lots of materials by both men and women.
So Bonnie's comment was that there were examples of art and memory that were created in the Japanese internment camps during the Second World War. Just along these lines, I think Rachel and Myrna and Faye have talked about examples of kind of community, the community that's created in telling these stories. But my mother's was not a communal activity. It was very much her story. And I think that there are probably certainly many examples of that kind of art and storytelling that came out of the Holocaust, for sure.
Yeah. Charlotte Solomon, for example, yes.
Right. So people approach, certainly I think for my mother, it was what she knew. She had never been trained as an artist, but she knew how she had been trained as a dressmaker, and she always stitched all her life. So she used the tools and techniques that she had. She had an incredible story that she always told during certainly all my life. I always heard my mother's stories, but she figured out a way to tell her story using the craft that she knew. And she, as I said in the film, she made it art. It was an artistic expression.
I think it is art.
I'm curious to know whether, as I try to learn about her process, did she sew and embroider and work on this massive project in solitude, or did she sometimes sew with others in the room with her and so on?
She did most of this by herself. Sometimes, my mother had a women's clothing store in Frederick at the time, and she was in the store. I mean, she ran a business. So in addition, this was like her spare time activity. When things were slow in the store, she would work on it, but she did it when there was no one else around. So for her, it was very much
internal.
She would talk about her memories while she was working on them, because the memories would become very much in the front of her mind. She would talk about them a lot to me, and I know to her sister, to my aunt, kind of reviewing, in a sense, her memories. But her work was her own.
She is unique. Well, we were all, each of us is unique, but her work is really unique.
Yes.
A couple of questions. When did she start doing this? It sounds like it was a very long period after the war. When you said she went to Frederick when she had grandchildren, did she start this project before then? And your father was also a survivor. What was his connection or involvement in your mother's work?
Yeah, my mother always told her stories, really almost immediately after they happened, I'm sure. And she told them to me, certainly, when I was old enough to listen to her. but she didn't start to do any of this work until she was about 50, so many years later. And the first picture that you saw of her childhood home, that was the very first picture that she did. And she did it just for her children. She did that one she gave to me, and she made a companion piece for my sister. And then she returned to them about 10 years later when my kids were born, when she was already in her 60s. And so this was really something that she came to in the later years of her life, which for me was also very inspirational, the idea that she could find this in herself, this wellspring of creativity so many years on into her life. Mm. But now that I'm about the same age, I understand that strong, that it really intense, I would say, desire to record, to document your own life. Right.
And to leave a legacy in the way that she did.
Faye, when in your reading, just to paraphrase, you noted that we all have to tell our own stories. And I think at this point in one's life, in these later years of one's life, I speak for myself, and I think I discern the same in my mother, that it's important to make sense of your story, to find the threads and piece them together of your own story, because no one else will, as you said.
You said that.
Yeah. No one else will, but no one else has exactly that same story. That's
exactly
what's so beautiful.
what I realized about my mother, that, as I said in the film, that I always knew that only she, even though she wanted me to tell her story, only she could really do that. Yes?
I had the privilege of seeing the exhibit at Strathmore a couple of times last year. And my experience is that of all the things that have been written, all the things that have been drawn, all the statements, all the physical memories, Esther's is the first and the only one I can think of that expresses it so colorfully. Yes. And I have to bring that up because in all that was brought out just this evening about these other artworks, these other fabrics, these other things done by these other women around the world, correct me if I'm wrong, these are single individual works that are then put together from these different countries. What other country, what other individual has a memory in story fashion? And I think about this over this last year. It made such an impression on me. Of all the readings, all the things that I've seen, Elie Wiesel, Mouse, I mean, all these wonderful stories, all these memories don't have the vibrant color and impression. They're all impressive, don't get me wrong, but don't have that impact in color. And I think that is what really stands out from this amazing woman.
Well, I certainly could not do justice to paraphrase that very beautiful and eloquent comment. But just to, I think, briefly restate your observation that of all the work that you've seen that tell the story of the Holocaust, beautifully rendered themselves, you haven't seen anything as vivid and colorful as Esther's work. I think Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett commented on this, reflected on it in the film, that my mother was always very aware of the duality of her life during the war, that while there was the brutal reality of the terror imposed on her and her family and the villagers, there was at the same time the beauty of nature around them. And she was, again, she wanted to capture what she saw. She was documenting. She wasn't taking artistic license in her view. She was simply documenting what she saw, and what she saw was beautiful.
Color.
And it was in color. It was not the black and white version of the Holocaust. It was in color.